New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
Hey everybody, Tracy Brown here. So glad that you joined me for today's episode of the Inclusive Church, where we come together every week to remind ourselves of our commitment to be leaders in inclusive spiritual communities, and we have the opportunity to explore what are specific, tangible, observable things, practical things that we can do, or conversations that we need to have in order to feed, birth, grow the commitment to being inclusive in our churches. And near the top of every show, I always like to give 2 reminders just in case there's someone who is watching live or the recording for the very first time. Reminder number 1, I am purposely using the word church as often or more often than I use community or ministry, because I want us to reclaim the word church to be focused on the people, not a piece of property. And so we want our churches to be inclusive of all kinds of people. And that is the focus. And so that's church is being used on purpose, but you will also hear me say spiritual community or sometimes our ministries. And then second, that often you will hear me refer to those of us who are leaders in our churches. And sometimes people think I'm only talking about ministers, but no, everyone who has a role in growing or expanding the church is the kind of leader I'm talking about. So the leaders on your ministry teams, the leaders who are volunteers, the leaders who are serving on your board of trustees or board of directors, the leaders who are building and growing with you. All of us as leaders are responsible for contributing to the church being inclusive. So, okay, all of that is out of the way. I think I might have forgotten last week, but I really do want to remember that to bring that up. So hello to Wayne. I'm so glad you're with us today. And anyone else who is live, feel free to type in a hello. We've got Henry, happy that you are here, and Anita. And I can see a bunch of other people on Facebook or YouTube. And it doesn't look like anybody's on LinkedIn today. or at least not yet, but feel free to comment as we go through our time together today. And actually, I am really interested in hearing or and seeing in the comments as I share about different parts of this conversation today. What had impact for you? We're going to spend a little bit of time reflecting on 2025 since this is the last show of the year, calendar year 2025. And just like many of us take time to do reflection about our personal lives and think about what we want to leave behind or what we want to grow, expand, or evolve in the coming year, I thought it would be really cool to take a half hour or so and reflect on 2025 with the inclusive church. Now, many of you know that the inclusive church, the concept of it, the part of the motivation for doing this show on the New Thought Media Network really is connected to and is an offshoot of the book Stained Glass Spirit, Becoming a Spiritual Community Where Oneness Does Not Require Sameness. And the next book in the series is going to be titled Inclusive Church or Inclusive Churches. And that got me thinking about, oh, well, what is it? What's important? How do we talk about this? And what tips do we have or suggestions do we have for people who want to build their toolkit? And so that's what we do with this show. And in 2025, it's not so much just looking at the titles, but when I did review the titles of the shows this year, there were a few topics that came up a lot, or I could see the thread that was connecting different topics. But one thing that really stood out for me in looking at everything we've been talking about is that it didn't feel it didn't feel random. It didn't feel like, oh, just some random topics. It felt like there was a lot of focus on building community where inclusion is valued. There was a lot of focus on both renewing and rewarding commitment, but the word commitment, that how do we show commitment to inclusion, and how do we, demonstrate commitment and encourage commitment based on what we reward. And maybe more than anything else, the way it's coming to my mind is that inclusion is about culture. And I'm not really surprised by that, but when I was reviewing all the topics, it's like, oh, this really is about building a culture, right? Where this becomes our norm in how we select leaders and how we invite people to participate in the programming we design and the events or services we offer. It's about building a culture where all the ways that God shows up are not just welcome, but are utilized to create an experience and to create a positive experience and to create opportunity to experience spiritual growth together. So some of the notes that I made, there are three things. When I started trying to group things into buckets, one of them might have been about belonging and refuge. Like some of you may remember, we spent a whole month talking about community and refuge and people being refuge for each other and being the kind of place where we could grieve together the treatment that happens, the negative treatment that happens in our communities based on differences or people who are different from maybe the mainstream. So there was a distinct emphasis on what I might call or think about inclusion within the church, within the congregation of the church. Is different from just saying, I like diversity or I accept diversity. Like that's kind of a concept, but when you truly have created or are creating inclusion, then it's not abstract like, oh, we've got some diversity. It's about how it feels to be studying with and practicing with people who have different backgrounds than your own. And way more than just saying, having a policy or holding up a flag that says, oh, you know, we displayed the pride flag. And so you will know that people who identify as LGBTQ plus in any of those categories know that they can come here. That's, you know, it's a sign, it's a symbol, but that inclusion is a lived experience. And that I kept going back to that throughout the year. Number two, it requires relational practices are what are required if you want to grow and then sustain the idea of inclusion. So how do people actually behave together? And what do you do over time to build the kinds of relationships that not just support, but that birth, right? And birth and nurture inclusion. And so the relationships that people have with one another, that came up in a lot of episodes. And I remember in several conversations with featured guests, I remember, you know, asking a number of people, so how do you do that? Like, what are the conversations you have? Or what are the requirements that you share with people in leadership that you expect them to do things over time in a certain way that does more than provide lip service to diversity or to inclusion? And then when I was looking at the episodes, the third thing that really came to mind for me was more than an ideology that we talked about presence, right? So the proximity, not just as physical closeness, but that there is proximity of people who are very different from each other by race or by age or by gender or by national origin or by gender identity or sexual orientation, that people representing many different identity groups are actually in proximity with one another and working together or studying together. And that the courage to engage in an authentic and vulnerable way with people who are different from you. It's like foundational if we truly are going to build inclusive churches. And so those three things stood out to me. And then I really looked at the year and the pattern. And pretty much in 2024, there was a lot of focus on kind of the why. What's the what is it in your spiritual tradition, in your religious tradition, in your faith tradition? What is it in the values and in the teaching that you have that is the imperative. What's the spiritual imperative for your commitment to inclusion? And from there, also in 2024, we did some things that were about practical application, but we were laying this foundation around the theoretical prioritization. And so in 2025, there was this very marked transition from the theory of being inclusive to the practical steps and the practical behavior, like actually integrating behavior into what you do. And that makes sense because in early phases of inclusion work, you do have to start with defining your values and what are the values or what's the motivation, what is your why. But once that's done, then you start asking the question, well, how do these values show up in everyday life? How are we living these values in the way that we practice together as being a community? And so I'm not really surprised, but as I look at, the topics and the themes for the year that really showed up quite a bit. And so I realize I am speaking from having spent, I don't know, 35 to 45 minutes really looking at the topics and the themes from throughout the year. And I want to put up a QR code if you want to go to, not now or at some later time, if you want to go to the playlist that where you can see most if not all of the episodes from the year. You can click on or scan this QR code and see the topics that we have been focused on in the last year, or maybe watch some of the shows that you missed, because when you look at the topic, you say, oh, I would love to know more about that, or I'm curious about what this guest had to say, or that guest had to say about, whatever the topic was for that week. So I will put the QR code for the playlist up again before we close. If you want to snap a photo of it or scan it and have the browser open it up in another tab, then you could do that as well. So all of this in service to looking back over the year 2025. And there is a part of me that's like, why are you doing that? But there is something about taking a breath. This past Sunday, I spoke at a church, and this particular church, their tradition historically has been that they have a burning bowl service on the last Sunday of the month and a white stone ceremony to set intentions for the year, the first Sunday of the year. Burning bowl the last Sunday of the year, and white stone ceremony the first Sunday of the next year. And so in prepping for that service and leading people through a ritual or a process, asking, what is it that you are ready to burn up, that you are ready to, what is ready to be released because it no longer serves you, but is ready to be released. In order to get there, you have to do some reflection. And you have to do some reflection about what you really loved about the year as well, if you given the time to do that. And so I think that for me, that doing the same thing with this show, Inclusive Church, was just part of, it felt really organic to not only look at the year for my personal life, but also the year for this show. So if you joined us a little later after the beginning, that's what we're doing. We are reflecting on 2025. So those three themes came up, and especially this transition from talking about inclusion in a theoretical way to more of the practical, what does it mean you do differently? And when I look at the topics for 2025, there was a little bit more of emotional tenor or emotionality, because inclusion work is challenging. And especially in some of the conversations with different featured guests, there was a fair amount of focus on how hard it is, how much emotional labor is involved in talking about these topics and in changing the way you do things. So if the more inclusive you are in bringing different kinds of people into your church, it requires the people who've been around for a while to change. And it requires leaders to not only be willing to change, but to encourage change that reflects the needs, the expectations, the experiences, the desires, the abilities of the people who are members of your church now, and the people who you are intentionally including or seeking to include in the near future. One of the episodes that I especially made me think about this was a conversation around valuing and including people with different disabilities, and how that there's emotion, especially the conversation where we talked about neurodiversity and people who are on mental health and neurodiversity, that those two topics, they're not the same thing, but was very, they both require some challenging shifts and some, people not even realizing how uncomfortable they were with people who were different from them or who processed information differently than they felt was normal, and how it requires emotional honesty to be inclusive, as well as a willingness to change and to grow. And so that idea that inclusion requires change for everyone, that it's not the people who are quote unquote different just coming in and making adjustments to what you're used to. But if you're truly committed to being inclusive, you have to be part of the change as well. So let me think, what else was there? There were a couple other things, and I am gonna, try to keep this to today to 30 to 35 minutes. So I'm not gonna go on and on and on, but there are a couple more things that came to mind. Inclusion is not a campaign, it is a culture. Inclusion is not a campaign, it is a culture. That's probably going to be a section title in the Inclusive Church book. And because when that hit me, it's like, oh, people say, okay, let's go do this. Let's have this class, or let's have this campaign, or, or this project, right? And I get it, because it's new and people are excited, and, they want to do something and they're really excited, but it's not just a campaign that, for the next 3 months or the next 6 months, we're going to, the first Sunday of every month, we're going to focus on that. It really is a deep commitment to create a culture. Systems and policies matter, and you have to have the culture in everyday practices of how people work together, how decisions are made, what you recognize, what makes people feel like they are part of the community or not. And so community becomes more resilient, and community becomes stronger when it recognizes the value of all different kinds of people studying and practicing together. And so it's not a campaign, it's a culture. We have to embody the practice, or embody the commitment to inclusion by the relationships that we build and the communication that we have. And all of that must keep going back to the spiritual imperative for the actions, for the choices. That's 2025 in a nutshell. It has been a really challenging year for many of us in New Thought communities, both what is happening politically in not just the US, but in the world, but also just changes in the economy, changes in healthcare, all of the shifts that have happened in our world, let alone shifts and changes and transformations in our families, or in our friend networks, or in our workplace. It's been a really challenging year for a lot of people. And if you're like me, you really value being in spiritual community together to navigate all of the shifts and the changes that happened this year and will continue to happen. So my hope for you is that when you have been able to participate in the Inclusive Church show, that you have been able to get little snippets of ideas or inspiration that have helped you not just survive all that's going on, but to actually build something long lasting in the church that you are a part of. And if you have suggestions for themes or topics for 2026, I encourage you to put them in the comments or the chat, or to send them to me directly, because we are building the focus for 2026 now and through the first month of the year. I can tell you that line, like, inclusion is not a campaign, it's a culture, is how I will be kicking off the first month of 2026. You're going to see that a lot, because it just seems to capture so much of what is important about being committed to building and growing an inclusive church. I'm going to give you the QR code one more time if you want to go back and see any of the episodes from 2025, or if you're just curious about who some of the featured guests were, or what we talked about And again, there may be a couple of shows that you missed that you're like, oh, wait, what was that one about? So grab the QR code and go to the browser, and you can always find past episodes there. My name is Tracy Brown. I am so delighted that you were able to join me and spend a little bit of time with me today right here on the New Thought Media Network. And I will see you next Tuesday at noon Mountain Time. Until then.
Thanks for watching The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Join us again next week at 12 noon Mountain Time.